In past years, if you had told me there was a lens that was an ultra wide autofocusing for a full frame camera and it has a price tag of $200, I would look at you sideways and be very skeptical. However, this year, Viltrox had stepped up to the challenge and had released a lens that's just that. The 14mm f4 lens for a full frame camera that has autofocus and a price tag of $200. Is this a lens that's worth investing or is it a waste? I'm going to talk about my initial impressions on this lens and answer that question. Just a really quick note, this video is not sponsored. The vendor has no say in the production of this video and the thoughts here are of my own. I purchased the lens with my own money and I do have an affiliate link in the description below. If you're interested in buying, it helps out this channel at no additional cost to you. Recently, I've been doing some photography around town with this lens, and I gotta say, I'm pretty impressed about the quality of images produced by this lens. For example, I think the images are pretty sharp. I also think that the autofocusing system of this lens is pretty decent. More on that later. And also, I think the lens handles flare pretty well. If you're shooting 14mm in the middle of a bright sunny day, I think it's not uncommon to include the sun in your shots, and having the ability to control flare to the point where it's not a negative distracting element of the picture is important. So let's take a look at some examples. If you shoot a Sony full frame camera and you're exploring full frame lenses with an ultra wide focal length, your options are kind of limited. If you're going with a first party lens and you want a 14mm prime lens, you're pretty much stuck with the 14mm f1.8 from Sony. And if your budget doesn't allow for that, well, you're kind of stuck. If you're looking at zoom lenses, prices aren't that much lower if you compare it to that, and you might still be stuck. Now, if you go with a third-party lens and you're looking for a 14mm prime lens, you're looking at something like Rokinon, that's still a few hundred or several $100s, and you're stuck with a manual focus lens. And if that doesn't fit your criteria, well, then you're still stuck. But now we have the Viltrox 14mm f4 lens that is available for you to explore. So why a 14mm lens, you might ask? Well, for me, I typically shoot between 24 and 200 millimeters. Most of my lenses actually cover that range, with the exception of the fisheye and now the 14mm lens. With a wider focal length, you can get a much wider field of view. Obviously, a lot of people talk about that, but in addition to that, you get a different perspective. Now, those two are different because if you take a lens, you take a picture and you step back, moving backwards gives you more in the frame, but it also gives you a different perspective. Anytime you move your camera, it gives you a different perspective. And I covered that in the previous video, so if you're interested, I'll drop a link in the description below. And with the 14mm lens, I'm really hoping to take advantage of that perspective and then really compose shots that will give you a unique perspective for things that are close versus things that are further away. Now we have some autofocusing tests for this lens. Now keep in mind, I have the Sony a7 III, which is an older camera, so newer cameras might be even better with this lens. We have the Viltrox 14mm f4 lens on the Sony a7 III. If you're wondering what it looks like in terms of vlogging at arm's length, here it is. Now compared to something like a 24mm lens, which I also have, I did a previous video on the Sigma 24mm f1.4 and doing the same test, it's harder to compose the shot because the field of view is a lot tighter. Even though I can fit my face in it, it's easy to accidentally cut myself off if I'm not paying attention. Whereas with this one, I can move side to side, up and down, right? And I'll still be within the shot. You get a lot more to work with for such a wide field of view lens. And one of the things that you should be aware of when using a lens like this, being an ultra wide lens, is that a characteristic of the lens is that it exaggerates stuff that's on the edge, right? So if I'm moving my head towards the edge of the frame, you can see it stretch out. Same thing if I'm moving closer, you can see the facial features does get exaggerated. So that's not really desired in a portrait shot, but for some other creative shots, like maybe like in lights and shadows, you might want that effect. So it depends on what you're shooting. But in case you're vlogging, this might be an option for you if you can work with the f4 aperture and the autofocus speed, which to me, in my opinion, is fine for this kind of video. For my YouTube videos, I probably won't be using the 14mm lens as my A camera with the studio shot as is, because the way the camera is positioned, you can see the edge of the key light. You can see that poster that's way off to the edge of the room, and I don't want that in my A camera shot. Maybe as a B camera to show the behind the scenes, and I can have that as a second angle, but not for the A camera. Now, let's talk about the build quality as well as the ergonomics for using the Viltrox 14mm f4 lens. Starting with the lens hood, it's actually pretty difficult to remove at first. I thought I was actually going to accidentally break it off because it's plastic, but you have to use quite a bit of force, and then once you get this to twist, you can take this off and then reverse it. Now, putting this back on, I'm not a big fan of because you can accidentally cross-thread it pretty easily compared to something that's more premium. So you can definitely feel that it's not the best. And then once you line this up and twist it, there you go. You feel that snap, now it's on properly. Now, I'll probably just leave this on the way it is. And since this is such a small and lightweight lens, I'll probably stick it in the bag like the way it is now without reversing the lens hood, which is probably not the best, but it's small enough that I can probably get away with it. The front has the, of course, lens cap, and you know, it's a generic lens cap. And once you take this off, you're able to see that it takes 58mm filters, which is pretty cool. I still like to stick a UV filter on just to protect the front lens element. And then over here in the back, we have a Viltrox lens cap, which is similar to these Sony ones. Taking this off, you can see there is a USB port for firmware updates. I haven't tried it yet, but it is there if you need it. And then nothing along the sides other than a focus ring. So that's all you get in terms of the interface. It's pretty dampened, which is pretty nice. There's no autofocus, manual focus switch, which is unfortunate. I am a big fan of that because it allows you to switch to manual focus pretty easily without going through the menus in your camera. I know you can map it to one of the custom buttons on the camera, but it's still like having a dedicated switch on the lens. But for $200, I can't really complain about that. Now, I do want to take some time to talk about how close you can get to your subject with this lens, and you can get fairly close. Even though this was never intended to be a macro lens, especially at 14mm, I think it's quite impressive how close you can get. For example, in a time lapse with this watch that you saw a little while ago, the lens was pretty close, and if you look at the behind the scenes, you can just see how close you can focus. And by the way, I was shooting at full frame. It wasn't at Super 35. I didn't do any cropping with that other than fitting it into a 16:9 aspect ratio. And you can see that you can get fairly close to your subject. All right, let's sum this up by going over the pros and cons of this lens, starting off with the pros. First off, you have that combination of a 14mm full frame lens that has autofocus all in one package for $200. That in itself puts this into a special class of lenses, I guess you would say, because if you look at the cheaper 14mm full frame lenses that are third party, so like the sub $600 range, give or take, a lot of them don't have autofocus, and this does. And it's pretty reliable, so I think that is awesome. The other thing is that, you know, besides the image quality being great, which is the important part, which I covered before, again, this also has a 58mm thread in front, so you can accept 58mm filters. So if you want to put in a UV filter to protect that front lens element, that's an option for you. Also in the back, as I mentioned, there's a USB-C for firmware upgrades if you choose to do so. So you got those options there, again, all in one package. Now let's talk about the cons of this, and I think there's three major cons. First one being the obvious one, it is an f4 lens, but you can't complain about the f4 aperture for $200 with all the stuff that I mentioned before, right? So f4, in my opinion, is usable if you know what you're getting into. I do have the 24-105 f4 lens from Sony, and again, same aperture, it's a constant aperture zoom lens, so dealing with f4 is very usable outside, but once you bring it indoors, you're gonna have to bump up your ISO or slow down your shutter speed to compensate, and with this, you're gonna have to do the same exact thing. So knowing that limitation, if you're okay with that, it might be a lens for you, but if you need that bigger aperture, this lens might not be for you. Some of the other lenses that are manual focus that I've been talking about, like the Rokinon one, they're the 14mm f2.8, so you get an extra stop off of this one, but you lose the autofocus ability for a slightly higher price. So maybe check that out if you need something with a wider aperture. The other thing is that the lens hood isn't really well built. I'm not a big fan of it. As I mentioned before, it's hard to take off and put back on. And then the last thing that I don't really like is the lack of the autofocus manual focus switch. I like to do that just for the ease of switching between the modes versus using it on the camera body. But again, at $200, that's not a showstopper. So after all that's being said, I do have an additional thought, and that is, what does the long-term reliability look like for this lens? And honestly, I don't have an answer for that because this is the very first Viltrox lens I've ever owned. I've had Sigmas in the past. I have one Tamron lens that I've used in the past as well, and none of them had to be sent in for repairs, so I've had pretty good luck with them. So knock on wood, oh, there's no wood around, fingers crossed that this lens will last me for years to come. To answer the question, is this worth buying or is it a waste? Personally, knowing the limitations, I accept those, and I think it's worth it to buy this. That's all I got for this video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and I'll see you in the next video.